Welcome back to Free Speech Nation with me, Andrew Doyle. So, the House of Lords passed the Online Safety Bill this week, which effectively outsources state censorship to unelected regulators. Children's charity NSPCC said the law would mean a safer online world. But critics argue it'll allow a regulator and tech firms to dictate what may or may not be said online. So, is this a troubling threat to free speech? Journalist and author Ella Whelan joins me now. Hello, welcome to the show. Now, you've been talking about this for a long time on Spiked and in various other publications. We've been talking about it on this show, but for a lot of people, it's appeared out of nowhere. Suddenly it's law, and a lot of people really don't know what it's about. What are the dangerous implications of this bill?
Well, the entirety of the bill is pretty bad.
Right.
Because it's, in principle, it's founded upon the idea that the public square of the online world should be controlled primarily by government, but by big tech.
Yes.
And that social media Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, should have powers to be able to, one, prevent what we see and control what it is that's the kind of content that's put out. It's done in terms of what's considered illegal. So part of that is kind of no-brainers, child pornography, extreme violence, terrorism, but also linked into what's considered illegal is sort of hate crime, whatever that means.
Yes.
Abuse, whatever that means, coercion, controlling behaviour, whatever that means. And so essentially what it's doing is setting up a relationship between the public and the internet, which is incredibly censored, incredibly controlled. And in a new world where, particularly post-pandemic, a lot of political discourse happens online.
Yes.
A lot of organising of people's private lives happens online, and it's a really, really big problem.
Well, the NSPCC talks about child safety and that kind of thing. You mentioned the example of child pornography and even things like death threats and that kind of thing. Those are already illegal, and those are things that are already routinely removed by social media platforms. It's not as though Twitter is awash with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But what they're conflating with this online safety bill is things that people, they've used the term legal but harmful speech, things that are psychologically or emotionally distressing.
Yeah.
That's the worry, isn't it, here?
Yeah, and they specifically use the term sort of psychological harm and hate that causes psychological harm, which is interesting because it's sort of, there's harm and then there's psychological harm. The emphasis on mental health in this bill is quite explicit in a way that sort of takes for granted the idea that it's a given that if people interact with what they call hateful content, there will be psychological harm. So it's completely denying any sort of robustness among the public. But the thing about sort of, combating things that are bad, like I said, child pornography, extreme violence, terrorism and things like that, or take, for example, stuff like children seeing suicidal content, which is a kind of dark new feature of the modern world. And obviously there was the case of Molly Russell and, kids seeing some pretty bad stuff. The idea that that is going to be that sort of trend in society of children being able to see things that are age inappropriate, whether it's porn or these kind of violent things, is one, the responsibility of tech firms, or two, to be solved by trying to get tech firms to clamp down on us, completely misunderstands the fact that this is a cultural problem.
Yes.
That it's the duty of, we have to ask about what parents are doing, what kind of people are talking about in their peer groups. It's a cultural issue.
Yes.
It's a cultural political issue, not a technical one that can be fixed by a bill that forces tech companies to intervene into our private lives.
And there are two things to consider in terms of who is going to be responsible for the censorship. So on the one hand, outsourcing it to Ofcom or some unregulated regulator who hasn't been elected. Now, of course, we know that these bodies are often ideologically captured. They tend to have a particular view of the world. If you give them that kind of power, isn't it open to exploitation? Yeah,
well, definitely. I mean, in the question of Ofcom, there is, they've made some, I'd say, pretty dodgy decisions in the past, certainly politically loaded ones. We know that there was a kind of an issue around links to Stonewall or the way in which it treated gender-critical content in the past. But also there is this row over encryption, so whether or not Ofcom can essentially give people notice, give platforms notice to say that they have to mine their content to prevent things that are illegal, terrorism, child pornography. But breaking encryption and enforcing, say, for example, WhatsApp is forced to read its users' messages. anyone can make the argument and say, well, wouldn't you want that if it just saves one person from viewing child pornography? What that kind of, you can do that zero-sum game of say, it has to happen, we have to sacrifice this. And I think we forget all of the benefits and all of the pros of privacy encryption, whether that be sort of political activism, private lives, privacy in terms of our ability to differentiate our public lives and our lives at home.
Yes.
And I think we forget we sort of almost throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is that these big fearful things are used to clamp down on freedom that actually is necessary for so much of our lives. And, the Online Safety Bill has been framed in terms of being about protecting kids, which who's going to sit here and argue that kids shouldn't be protected?
Right.
But in actual fact, when you scroll down the gov.uk website, you see that actually most of it is about adults, and most of it is about saying sort of adults will be able to ask big tech to filter out hate for them. What the hell?
What does that mean, though? Exactly, yeah.
And but it's actually, the bill infantilizes us. It treats the whole of society like we're children, and the internet is not primarily a children's space.
Yes.
It isn't. It's meant to be an adult space.
What about this idea? We have tested what happens when big tech are given the power to censor. We've seen since the release of the Twitter files that the staff at Silicon Valley were very much censoring opinions they didn't agree with that were perfectly legal, and they were doing it routinely and sometimes at the behest of government officials. Right, so that's what happens when you give big tech the power to do this. So surely we should have learnt our lesson by now.
It's this idea that sort of everyone who's involved in Twitter or YouTube or, sat in the lovely offices in Google and stuff like that are sort of a perfect example of the public, a demographic representative that sort of has left and right and everything in between, and they all sit around in their editorials when they decide what to censor and say, well, hang on a minute, Andrew has been, very fair in his opinions, and let's leave him be. That's nonsense.
Exactly.
In fact, actually, it's sort of, it's kind of a much more benign censorship, which is that there isn't a kind of political weight behind it. It's just expressive of this kind of knee-jerk anti-risk reaction, which is that any political opinion that pushes the boat out, any political opinion that might be challenging a consensus tends to just get, whether it's shadow banned or whatever, gets pushed down. And I think underneath all of this is a real kind of misanthropy, particularly from politicians and the House of Lords. The idea that if given freedom, if given liberty online to be able to talk freely, all that will happen is we'll end up in a cesspit. And that's not to underestimate the nasty side of Twitter in particular.
Oh, yeah.
I think everybody knows that exists. But I think we really have to push back on the kind of founding principle of the Online Safety Bill, which is that freedom is awful, freedom is dangerous, and given freedom online, people will become disgusting, and I just don't think that's true.
So also, isn't there the issue that if you say to the big tech firms there will be financial penalties, major financial penalties, if you fail to remove hateful content, aren't they just going to censor everything and think about it later?
Yeah, there will be, again, these companies, big business, big tech is not sort of interested in bettering I wish it were, the Academy of Ideas is, interested in bettering political discourse or opening up free spaces for debate. It's actually really insidious how much the language of freedom, the language of liberty is used and twisted by both the government and these institutions to say, we have these 25 different codes of conduct that control you and the way what you can say in various ways to empower your free speech. It's just so, it's so annoying and it's such load BS. But it's again, you have to come back to the idea of who is best to decide for you as an adult what you interact with online. Is it Mark Zuckerberg or whoever, Elon Musk? Is it your local MP? Is it an unelected member of the House of Lords? Or is it yourself? Right. And actually, I think we have to get a lot better at saying that we take the responsibility to, if we want to make change in the online world, because I do want to stop, kind of the nasty stuff that happens there, of treat it like the real world, which is that when you see something that's wrong, you interact with it, you try and stop it. You don't call the police and say, can you go knock on her door because she's put up something hateful online. OK, very interesting message. Ella, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Next up on Free Speech Nation, I'll be talking to academic and author Alka Sehgal-Cuthbert, who has no platform this week from the Rethinking Education Conference after other delegates claimed that her opposition to critical race theory made them feel unsafe.